We've been talking about how the church building came about, and we're going to look at scripture next week to sum it all up, but today we're going to finish up, we're going to round out the history of the church a little bit, and we're just going to talk about a few things. Today's going to be kind of a short study, but we're going to talk about three things today. The steeple, the pulpit, and the pews, or balcony.
Daddy Campbell has a question.
Yeah, yes ma'am.
Are we going to be in like a specific book in the Bible?
We're not going to open the Bible today, actually. So we're just going to...
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we're all good. Yeah, so we're going to... We open the Bible sometimes, but right now what we're doing is we're kind of going through a history, and then next week we're actually going to look at the Bible and say, what does the Bible say that the church really is? So
okay.
We're looking at some of the ways and things that came about in the church that aren't really in the Bible.
Okay,
yeah. All right, so have you ever wondered where the steeple, I know a lot of modern churches don't have it today, but where the steeple came from? Steeple came about? Kind of this big pointy thing on top of a church, and does it even make sense? Huh?
With the bell inside?
Some of them have bells, yeah. Some of them don't. Some of them are just part of the architecture. Have you ever wondered where it's from? Nope.
What would you say?
Where did the steeple come from? Where did
Yeah.
the idea of a steeple come from?
I don't know.
He said from the Catholic Church.
Roman Catholic.
No. So if you think back to Egyptians and Babylonians, what did they build? What did the Egyptians build?
Pyramids.
Pyramids. What did the Babylonians build?
Tower Babylon.
Towers, yeah. So back in the days of the Egyptians and the Babylonians, they desired to reach toward heaven. Their goal, their aim was to lift mankind up into heaven and actually unite with deity, unite with the gods. Okay? And so the Egyptians crafted the obelisk, which the bigger obelisks were the pyramids, of course. Babylonians, they created towers, and we read the history of the Tower of Babel, their intent was to somehow reach toward the heavens and again, be united with the gods. And then the Greeks and the Romans came along. Primarily Greeks, but then Romans borrowed their architecture. But how did the Greeks design their buildings?
With pointy thing.
Are you
Big
talking
old
about columns?
Well, columns, but in general, the buildings were large, quite large. Think about the temples. So what ended up happening was where the Egyptians and Babylonians wanted to reach toward the heavens, the Greeks essentially wanted to bring the heavens down. So they crafted temples to essentially house the gods. They were their focus was building temples large enough where the gods would come down and reside in them and live in them.
Like the house of like Zeus and the
Yeah.
house of what? Yeah. So
Yeah.
they made like houses for each god.
Yep.
Okay.
So the Greeks, they were the ones that wanted to bring it down, or they were the ones that wanted to go up?
Babylonians and Egyptians wanted to aspire to immortality. They wanted to go up to the gods, up to heavens. The Greeks wanted to bring the gods down. So then the Roman Catholics, they reintroduced the obelisk as a steeple. Okay, they began the Byzantine Empire. The Romanesque period saw that the steeples were added to the cathedrals, and then finally rounding this off, Gothic architecture again wanted people to focus or set their attention on the heavens. And so not only were steeples or spires, we talked about spires last week, not only spires were added to churches, but in the Gothic architecture, spires and these predecessors to steeples were added to almost every building. So all of Gothic architecture was pointing people upward. Okay, and so the idea here was that they wanted folks to aspire to grow. They wanted folks to strive upward, to be better than themselves, to, again, in some form or fashion, to aspire to immortality. And then throughout Italy, some of the steeples started containing church bells, once again calling people to come to worship, saying, all right, now is a time where we can come together and aspire to focus or set our sights higher collectively. In other words, we're setting time aside to focus on higher things. Spires represented man's desire to be reunited with their Creator.
Are spires a group of people or a thing?
Spires are the predecessor to the steeples.
Think about it like
Pointing.
Russia. Like
Oh,
in Russia.
okay. Oh yeah,
So they have them in Russia where they're like
Mhm.
spirals.
got it.
Mm-hmm. And then over the years, the spires grew taller and thinner, and becoming the main architectural point or focus point. And then in 1966, or 1666, sorry. A major fire broke out in London. Okay, and it burned down almost all 87 churches in London.
It's because it had 666 in it.
So what ended up happening was Sir Christopher Wren, I'll write his name up here. Sir Christopher Wren was commissioned to redesign the church building. Okay. And what he did was he modified the Gothic style. He updated it, but he still kept the spire. But it's him that we kind of look to as the crafter or the designer of the modern steeple, what the steeple looks like today.
No, was he asked to craft it differently because there was a problem with the architecture and that's what caused them all to burn?
No,
Or
no, he was just a designer. He was an architect, and so he's commissioned to.
like, why wouldn't they have done it the old way? They're like, those are all gone.
Well,
Do
I mean, it
something
was
new.
Gothic, so why not create
Do
something more
something new.
modern? Yeah. There was no point in rebuilding Gothic architecture. It wasn't that hip.
It's like how we don't live in plantations anymore.
Mm-hmm. And then the Puritans came along.
Mm-hmm.
They designed obviously much simpler church buildings, typically 1 or 2 rooms only, smaller buildings. But they kept the steeple. They simplified the steeple, but they kept it. So a lot of the, and we've seen this as we've gone. If y'all remember, we went to Pigeon Forge and we went on the plantation. We saw some of the churches. The steeples weren't very tall. They were quite short. You could actually climb up there and ring the bell in some of them. But they weren't large steeples. So the Puritans simplified the church buildings dramatically, including the steeple. But they still kept it. And that is how we got the steeple. Okay? So when you look at a steeple, there is no spiritual significance to it. It was simply put in place because it represents mankind's desire to look or focus heavenly or heavenward. And now we look at the pulpit. Okay?
Wait, I thought you already said where the pulpit came from.
Huh?
I thought you already said where the
That's the
pulpit came
steeple.
No.
Not yet.
I know, I thought you had told us where the pulpit came from last week.
Nope. I told you we were going to get there, but we hadn't got there yet. So, do y'all remember from last week where the preacher originally taught from?
The big chair?
Big chair. What was that called?
The
The big chair.
cathedral.
Cathedra. Very good.
Okay.
That's where we get cathedral from. So original sermons were preached or taught. They weren't really preached. They were taught from sitting down in the cathedra. And then later on, in the first couple of centuries, another device was introduced. The ambo. You don't see this a lot in churches today because it's really, really old. But essentially what an ambo was is it was a platform that had a chair in it. But the platform, again, I'm not an artist, but imagine the platform up here, okay? And then to the side, both sides, there were stairs or steps leading to it, okay? And so from both sides, you could enter the ambo from either side. These were steps. Obviously, this is a wall here, but there's steps behind it leading up, and then someone would sit here in a chair
Is that in front or behind the wall?
behind the wall.
Okay.
Yeah, all this is a wall here. So there's steps behind it, and there's a chair behind the wall as well. So it looks like a pulpit from the front, but there's a chair behind it, and it's essentially steps on both sides leading up to it. It's an elevated platform from which the priest taught.
Well, and I remember, I don't know if this refers to that, but I remember in some of the churches that I saw in Europe, it was like, almost like in the middle of the church building, there was like, almost like a little mini spiral staircase.
That's not it this yet. That's not it.
Okay,
I'm about to get to that.
okay,
This is not an ambo. That is not an ambo.
okay.
Okay.
Is this an ambo? Similar?
No, that is what she's talking about.
Oh,
That's the
okay.
wine glass.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. Wine glasses, even in colonial, you'll see them a lot more often. Ambos are very old. In the mid 3rd century, they started fading out. So that's why I'm saying if you find them, they're in pretty old churches. Okay, you may find them in Europe, but only in the older cathedrals.
So not here in America.
Not here in America. You wouldn't see them here in America. Okay. Okay. The idea, this was originally, the seat itself, sitting down and teaching from a chair or from a desk, was an idea borrowed from the Jewish synagogue. When the teachers taught, they would do it from two positions. They'd stand up and teach, or they'd sit down and teach. If they stood up and taught, the rabbis were simply sharing ideas or thoughts, but it wasn't necessarily something with authority. When they sat down, that's when they spoke from authority. So if you remember, Jesus many times would sit down to teach. This was actually a cultural thing. When he taught sitting down, he taught from a position of authority. Okay, so again, this chair, this idea of teaching while sitting is borrowed from the synagogue, because the priest here was in essence teaching from an elevated position of authority. And in 250, the ambo was replaced by the pulpit.
BC or 80, right? 80.
They wouldn't have anything to preach before Christ.
Well, in the Jewish temples.
There was no pulpit in the Jewish temples.
What,
So
what was the date that you said, Eddie?
250.
80.
Heather, there are, if you search for ambo on Google, there will be a few pictures. Most of them show the wine glass,
Yeah.
but there are a few pictures. But look for this kind of
Okay.
V kind of thing. Now, interesting thing about the pulpit is that Cyprian of Carthage talks about a public office that the leader of the church would ascend the pulpitum, which is the Latin word. From which we get the English word pulpit from. What does pulpitum mean, our Latin students?
I don't know. I don't know all the
What are
Latin
y'all
words.
learning? Come on now.
I only know about Caesar and the Gauls and how they kill each other. And Mary and Christ.
Pulpitum
Yeah.
is translated as stage.
That's all I
What
do.
declension is
How
that?
they kill each other in all the wars.
Daddy,
all
what's
I-
the
You
declension
and
is
wouldn't that
that?
be second declension?
There's a couple with
I have no idea. I haven't taken Latin since I was in high school.
Second declension neuter.
Wait,
Yeah.
did you go to public high
Nominative.
school?
Hmm?
Did you go
What'd
to
you say?
public high
Nominative
school?
singular.
Nominative singular. Okay.
All right. It is nominative singular. It's a noun. All right. We get the English word pulpit from the Latin word pulpitum, which means stage. Okay. Pulpit was propped up in the highest elevated position in the congregation. Now, oftentimes the congregation, we'll talk about this in a minute, but pews were eventually moved into a circular fashion. Okay. One of the recent movies that you can see this from, actually, the movie isn't recent, but recently viewed by our family, is Pride and Prejudice. If you remember, there's one scene where Mr. Collins is in the middle, and he's kind of here preaching, and then there's pews facing this way, pews facing this way, pews facing this way, pews facing this way. Okay? And so the idea was that you didn't have necessarily people looking at each other, but they were looking at pretty much nothing, so they could focus. The idea was to focus on what the preacher was saying, but it was an elevated position in the middle of the room. So if you have to go back and watch the recent movie of Pride and Prejudice, you see him preaching, everybody falling asleep, and he's there in the middle of the room. He's not up at the front as we would think of in today's auditoriums. Okay. In time, a common phrase was having the preacher or the priest ascend the platform. This was the concept, was that they were ascending to an elevated position, a position of authority. Cyprian also alluded that the platform separated the clergy from the laity, and he said that the pulpit was sacred and that it was a venerated position, a most holy, separated position from the area of the laity.
the dumb people.
Not the dumb people, the congregation.
I know, but like the
Non-clergy. They're not dumb. Non-clergy. So the pulpit was introduced in 250, overtaking the ambo in popularity, but it didn't really become popular until the Middle Ages, and then it was the primary, the primary focal point by the time of the Reformation. It was the focal point of the church, the congregation. All eyes and ears were focused on the pulpit. And you asked about the Mass last week. So what we see happening here is in this time period between 250 and then the Reformation in the 16th century, there's a shift taking place. A shift coming from the Mass, which is more of a ritualistic action, people coming in, following rituals and whatnot, to an environment where you have someone teaching. So if you've been part of Catholic Mass, I'm not saying this is not meant to be all inclusive, but a generic statement was it's very ritualized. And so the Mass is around certain rituals, certain things. We say this, we do this, we follow certain order within the Mass. Whereas the style overall, by the time the Reformation hit, was more of someone teaching. There was some instruction given from the pulpit. And so they had less emphasis on rituals and more focus on someone teaching the word. And then a couple of notes. Lutheran churches, the pulpit was moved in front of the altar. So if y'all remember, we talked about this last week, where the churches were designed in kind of this box, early on, kind of this box format. And you had the area up here, okay, and then the altar was placed here, and then the initially the priest taught from the back, okay, behind the altar. In Lutheran churches, the pulpit was moved right here in front of the altar. The Reformation or Reformed churches would actually move the altar or move the pulpit from behind the altar. All right.
Okay.
And then the altar, was also in Reformed churches was then replaced by the communion table. But in Reformed churches, even though, and I use the term, I'll get you 1 second, even while many churches would say we're not Reformed, I'm not talking about Reformed as in Arminian versus Calvinism. I'm not talking about Reformed. I'm talking about Protestant churches, Reformed churches that are broken away from Roman Catholicism. So using the term Reformed in a very generic fashion, using the historical term versus the theological term. Yes, Campbell?
What's the proper way how to spell Lutheran? Can you just...
Lutheran.
So the people that are, using your definition of Reformed, are people that don't practice Roman Catholicism anymore?
Correct.
It's churches during their after the Reformation.
Yeah, I mean, it's more like, it's Protestantism, but it's also, you had certain denominations come out of Protestantism.
What's Protestantism?
People who protested against Roman Catholicism. Martin Luther, 99 Theses.
95?
95 Theses, yes, sorry.
You know what it's called.
And then essentially, the pulpit does exactly what the name implies.
It's a stage. Right here.
Performance.
It elevates the clergy above the laity and puts the clergy on a stage. Again, day's kind of quick, but I'm just hitting some last minute topics here. And then finally, we're going to look at the pews and the balcony. And the pew is from the Latin word podium, or which is also the English word
Podium?
podium.
It's genitive, Gracie.
Okay, Latin podium or podium. And it means
Like lift it up.
raised seat or balcony.
Ah, I was close.
Wouldn't it have to be of race or something?
It's just me.
Okay, so pew comes from the Latin word podium, or where we get the English word podium, and it means raised seat or balcony. The pew was unknown to the church for the first 1,000 years. There was no such thing as a pew the first 1,000 years of the church.
Where do
Okay?
people sit? Just on the floor?
I'm about to answer that. They stood the entire time.
Lord mercy.
They stood the entire service. Now, there's something interesting about this that I'll come back to in a minute. But
Get rid of the chairs.
there were two modes of worship in the New Testament church. Okay, and it's really cool, I think, about this because when you, and I'm not being critical, I'm not saying this to be critical, but when you think about church today, and people joke around about this today, they're like, 1 minute I'm standing, 1 minute I'm sitting, 1 minute I'm standing, 1 minute I'm sitting. It's just like up and down the entire time. Okay, and there's nothing wrong with that.
It's like Catholics.
Well, but even Protestant churches, people are like, I have to get up and stand up for this one song, then we sit down, have announcements. I got to get up again, then we sit down, and then we get up again and sit down, and then we finally have the message. And I got to get up again at the end of the message. So people are just, they'll find anything to complain about. But anyway, the thing is, in the New Testament church, there were two modes of worship. There was kneeling and there was standing. Okay? Kneeling was during time of prayer. And the New Testament church kneeled during their times of prayer as a form of supplication, a form of surrender. They kneeled in prayer to offer and confess their sins, recognizing that they are unworthy in a sense because of their sin, because of their depravity, to come before a holy God. And so kneeling was a sign of humility during time of prayer. The second mode of worship is again standing, and they stood during times of singing, and they stood in times of instruction. Why did they do that? Well, interestingly enough, it comes from the idea. Now, obviously, they didn't have the Bible until 350, 360, okay? But the New Testament church stood in their times of service in singing and instruction because of the idea that we find in Hebrews. The idea that because of what Jesus did on the cross for us, we can come before the throne of God in boldness. And so they saw themselves standing in a way of recognizing what Christ did on the cross, and them standing, not kneeling or bowing before a king, but standing before a king in all boldness. So even them standing was a sign of worship because they recognized their position in Christ. So again, kneeling or bowing for prayer and standing for all other times. So in the first 1,000 years, the church didn't have any place to sit. They stood the entire time. All right, then we'll go through a little bit of history. 13th century. Go through a few different centuries here real quickly. In the 13th century, pews were introduced, and essentially they were brick or stone benches that were placed up against the walls. And so people used the wall as a backrest, but they were just stone or concrete. Well, they have concrete, but stone or rock benches.
Daddy.
Yep.
Do you have the reference for the Hebrews verse that you were saying?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay.
And then eventually, the benches were moved into the center, into the body of the building, and so they weren't on the walls anymore. They moved into the middle, and then they were arranged in a semicircle around the pulpit. Okay, so the pulpit's in the middle, semicircle, and then eventually they were bolted to the floor.
Bolted?
Bolted.
So you said they were on the walls.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's another one that I missed, and then they were in a semicircle.
No.
Okay.
They were on the walls, and then they were moved into the middle, into a semicircle.
Around the
pulpit.
Okay.
So, question: were the chairs pushed up against the wall or physically on the wall?
They were pushed up against the wall.
Okay.
There's a bench up against the wall. We're using the wall as the backrest.
Make sure it wasn't like on the wall.
Mm-hmm. All right. Then we have the 14th century. In the 14th century is where the modern pew originated. Okay, it wasn't popular yet, but it's where the modern pew originated during the century. It wasn't actually common until the 15th century, but they started out replacing the stone benches with wooden ones. Okay, still no backrest yet, but
And cushions.
there were no cushions, just a wooden bench. And even when we went to, again, Pigeon Forge, when we went there a couple months ago or in the summer, y'all remember that some of the pews still didn't have backs to them. And even some of the pews that were there, the backs were added later. So initially, even during a lot of the Puritan churches, backs weren't on the pews. They're just flat wooden benches. All right, and then 18th century. I don't know if y'all remember this when we went to the plantation in South Carolina, but another type of pew was introduced. Anybody want to take a guess? It's where cushions started coming about.
Like ones with backs? I don't know.
They did, but something a little more fancy. Box pews.
What?
I don't
Okay.
know what that is.
So essentially, box pews were a small room within the church that had walls and a door, and they were property. So affluent people within the church could buy a boxed pew.
Oh, so it's like
Like
at the box, like the at the box, like at the box and or at a theater.
Well, so you had a church,
VIP pews.
and then you had the stage, pulpit, altar, and then what you end up having.
The walls wouldn't go all the way up to the ceiling, would they?
No, just probably to the top of this window here, so about 8 feet.
Then how would you see the person talking?
In a minute, I get there.
They were at the back. TV?
No, I get there. So people who could afford them would sit on the benches in the middle. People who could would buy boxed pews, and the more money you had, meant the closer you were to the pulpit. So you could buy a boxed pew closer if you had enough money. So the
Little church fundraiser there.
so in the box pew, you had cushions. You had armed or padded armed seats, curtains. You had even not just cushioned seats, but you had other like arm cushions, head cushions. Some of them you had fireplaces.
Oh my gosh.
Churches didn't have heat,
Oh,
so
I know.
Popcorn maker?
nope, no electricity. They had carpets. They would even have. They could decorate them any way they wanted to. Essentially, it's a room that they had. Yes.
So the people in the middle didn't have any of that.
Nope. They had to sit on the hard wooden pews.
Okay.
And
Peasants.
sorry,
They were the peasants.
they were the peasants. They had fireplaces, and they even had compartments for their dogs. If they wanted to bring their dog in, the dog could rest. Okay. They had pictures of family members. Again, this was their property that they owned, and they could decorate them any way they wanted to. The goal of this was their comfort. And each one of these box pews had a door with a lock and key. So they could lock it and no one else could go in. They owned it. It was essentially their room that they bought. Now, to answer your question, Isaac, how did they see above the 8-foot walls?
Oh, there's a TV in there.
No, there's no
electricity.
TV. There's no electricity at this time. What was introduced also because of this was, and you've already pointed out the picture, the wine glass pulpit. So we had the ambo. Now what we have is this kind of pulpit that had, I'm not a very good artist, but stairs going up into it. The pulpit was then elevated even more so the priest or pastor or preacher could see into the boxed pews, and they could also see the preacher teaching. So the wine glass pulpit was created. It was raised up so they could.
So if you're on the front row, you pretty much have to be like that.
It wasn't that high. I mean, think about if it's only an 8-foot wall, okay, then the person doesn't have to be that high. I could be sitting here looking at the person speaking. It wouldn't be that difficult.
So would that be in the middle, or would it be like at the front in the stage?
It doesn't. You'll see it a whole bunch of different places. The church that we went to in I believe South Carolina had it kind of like right here. There was one like right here. Okay. You'll see this also in many older churches that have them up against the wall. So there's a staircase ascending, and they'll have the wine glass type of
Okay,
pulpit.
This is probably like the best picture you'll see. Okay, so it has the wine glass, and then it has each box. So y'all, I'll just pass around my phone, and then y'all can look kind of, because I'm a visual person.
Yeah.
And so like, there's like boxes, and then there's the spine. Like,
Oh.
that's the closest one I could find in the past 2 minutes Googling. Because like you said, like I am.
Okay.
I love Josh's drawings.
Oh, those are all the
Visual
box
person.
pews on the sides.
Yep.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Your own phone, you can look it up.
It's like a cubicle.
Yeah, it's a cubicle.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Oh, I wonder if that's how like offices. You got your own cubicle when
I
you
don't know.
work.
I don't know. You don't like my wine glass?
No, I do. It's better than I could do. I didn't even attempt to draw it.
Wait, we should draw strong first. So these are still like modern. People
Yes,
still
that's
have
one of them.
box
No,
pews.
no.
No.
Because what ended up happening was, surprisingly, this gained a lot of criticism from the
Mhm.
clergy.
Mm-hmm.
And so they said, enough of this.
The clergy were complaining about it?
Yes, the clergy were complaining about it, saying there's something not right here from a heart perspective. And I'm sure they had other issues. I mean, we still have people falling asleep today in church, and there are no box pews. So now that you have a room
Just
to
sit back,
yourself,
pillows in there.
exactly.
Back.
They, for many reasons, the clergy complained against this, and so they ended up removing the box pews. But think about what's happened from, in a matter of 1900 years. Okay, so we're talking about 18th century. We've gone from, 1700 years. I'm getting my numbers messed up. 1700 years. We've gone from one style of worship that was very open, very communal. People gathered in a living room at a house, looking face to face, sharing what's going on in their lives, to a worship service, to a worship style that is very cold, that is very private, and very individualized. In essence, what's happened is we've lost the community aspect of the church.
And it's also pagan, is it not?
Well, there's many things here that's, as we've talked about, paganism is introduced into worship, into the church. But the overall effect, though, is that, again, the dynamic of church has changed. In 1700 years, the church has gone from a very family-oriented environment, a very non-threatening, very open and transparent environment, to one that's often stale, often cold, looking at the back of people's heads. Okay, and now instead of everyone sharing what's going on in their lives, it's all focused on one person or a group of people up on stage. Okay?
Daddy.
Yep.
Do you know the date for when they didn't use the box pews anymore?
I do not. So as the word says, a pew is a raised seat or a balcony. Okay? And the idea of a pew, the podium here, well, guess where podiums were used at?
Theater.
Very good. Theaters. So what happened was they took this concept in a theater and they moved it into a church. And it changes the idea from, again, everyone sharing to one person communicating and putting on a performance.
Well, that's what I thought about when you said box pews. I was thinking like the box
Seats.
box seats, like at the Fox or at a famous theater. That's what I
At
thought
a
of.
concert.
On the football.
So, and let me just add this side note here. This one's for free. But I often hear pastors, a lot of pastors, not one pastor, but a lot of pastors complain that it often feels like the pastor is doing everything and people in the congregation aren't doing much at all. And there's always a call for volunteers. The problem, though, is the argument or the request is almost self-defeating, because the church is designed today to put the emphasis on the pastor and not the entire congregation at whole. So the way the church is designed, the way it's architected and set up inside, puts all the focus, all the emphasis on the pastor or the choir or the worship team. And it really creates a atmosphere of passivity within the congregation. I'm just here to watch. I'm just here to be entertained. I'm just here to consume. And some of the other notes I have written down here is it renders the congregation as spectators. It turns the church into a spectator sport. Francis Chan has talked about this many times. All focus is set on a single individual, again, the pastor or a group, a worship team. And then it also conditions the church as a performance, and it leads to such sentiments as, well, the pastor was kind of dry today, or worship really didn't do much for me, or wow, on a positive note, wow, the band really rocked it today. Now, again, such sentiments are shared, and I know folks in leadership discourage those phrases, those ideas, but we have to be honest and realistic about, well, that's how the church is designed. The church is set up for the pastor to put on a performance, and many pastors do it well. They're all about putting on a performance. Many worship teams are all about putting on the performance. I mean, there's now tryouts for the worship team. Okay? Worship teams are paid positions. So we can complain about these ideas that are creeping into the church and these heart conditions, these mindsets, these phrases that are spoken by the congregation, interpreting the service as entertainment. But in reality, that's exactly how we've designed the church architecturally, is we've set it up and we've designed it to be an entertainment venue.
I guess like when you hear stage, like I don't think of a church. Like I guess I've been programmed to like think of it like a stage like as a theater for the actor. But like it does make sense now. Like now coming back to like what all of the Latin words and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So Daddy, you said that they would add, or they started to add balconies like theaters had?
Well, they will, yeah. So the pews hindered face-to-face interaction, and balconies were added in the 16th century. Okay, balconies were added in the 16th century. They were created by the Germans. And anybody want to guess what the purpose of the balconies were?
To have a better view.
That's pretty close, actually.
What do Germans call balconies?
I don't know, but they were invented by the Germans. I don't know the German
Is
word.
it to pack more
Do
people
you have
in?
a word, buddy?
No. Campbell's pretty close. It was actually not necessarily to get a better view, but to elevate them and bring them closer to the pastor. Remember, what's the focal point of the church at this point? The pastor. So balconies enable people to get closer, or more people to get closer to the podium.
Were they stereotyped for like the higher, like kind of like the boxes?
They were not, no.
Anybody could sit in the back.
It was just a function, yeah.
Okay.
Now, I know that in Americana slave days, I know that those were often reserved for slaves and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But in the 16th century, that was not the case.
Okay.
The heart behind it in the 16th century was we can put more people closer to the pastor because he is the focus point.
I mean, you can even think of churches today that have balconies, even in this county. It's like, hey, we're not going to stretch you all out and have more speakers. It's like, we're going to lift you up and keep you closer just from a practical, keep everybody close to the pastor.
Yeah.
All right. Modern day, 19th century. I know we're in the 21st century, but the 19th century saw the last major shift in church architecture. Okay? So bringing this up to modern day, 19th century, revivalism had the last major shift or major influence, and I'll write that on the board. Okay. Revivalism had the last major impact, and it transformed this type of church, which is still very much I can't even say the word, still very common today. Okay, we still see a lot of churches built like this, but in the 19th century, what do we see churches built like today?
Or like a business building.
Maybe. Or if you think about the theater, more like concert halls.
Okay.
Okay. The style they used was moving from, keep in mind, this is a simple form of Greek architecture. This type of church was introduced in the Reformation, okay, but it's still a very simplified version of Greek architecture. The newest architecture, 19th century revivalism, introduced the concert hall type of architecture for churches. And we see that a lot in especially the mega churches today. Okay, it was introduced through revivalism. And it was structured to heighten the dramatic performances of the preacher, the choir, and the worship team. It was designed to heighten the drama. That was its purpose. So it's putting more emphasis again on pastor, worship team, choir. And it suggests that the choir or worship team exists to stimulate worship and entertain the congregation. There are some churches that you have to not say get tickets, but you have to pre-register before you can, because they have too many people. So you have to save seats before you get in or get on a waiting list. We've turned church into a concert, unfortunately. And its focus is all about improving the overall experience of the congregant. It's all about the
Revivalism's
experience.
focus is that?
No,
Oh.
the concert style hall
Okay.
is all about improving the experience. It's not just about the message anymore now.
Mhm.
It's all about the overall experience. We want you to feel God. I got one more page. 5 minutes, I'll be done.
So, Daddy, how does revivalism go talk?
It,
or
do,
relate
it
to-
doesn't. It's what we see taking place in this.
What does revivalism mean?
We see a lot of the Great Awakenings happening here, revival breaking out, and so we're seeing a lot of, there's a lot of emphasis on the works of the Spirit and giftings, the external manifestations of the Spirit, like healing, speaking in tongues, all that kind of stuff. Again, it's experientialism is what it is. that's starting to creep in here. All right, a couple last points about all this, right? So we've talked about steeple, pulpit, pews, and balcony. A couple last minute things is one, the communion table was now moved. Remember, it shifted from an altar to more of a communion table during the Reformation. Communion table was moved to the floor in front of the pulpit. Okay, so if you see a lot of churches today, they may have a wooden table. A lot of them say, do this in remembrance of me. It's carved into most of the tables. Okay, on those tables, you'll find often, what will you find? Y'all?
When it's not communion time.
When it's not communion.
It's like a floral
flowers.
bouquet.
Flowers. Sometimes
Candle.
like
Candles.
candles, the Bible. Brochures.
Okay. So
Tracts.
yeah, so candles, Bibles, the cross,
A
and
lacy
flowers.
A lacy line that your grandmother made.
Doilies.
The doilies.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. So the candles themselves have origins in pagan worship. But again, often on the communion table you'll find the Bible or cross, some kind of spiritual element.
If it's Christmas time, you'll find like baby trees,
Yeah.
and then they'll like move everything and put a manger scene.
Also, many churches built baptistries behind you have the communion table, then the pulpit, the choir, and then you'll have the baptistry behind that. Very common. So to sum all these 3 weeks, 4 weeks up, I know we're getting to the scripture next week, but to sum all this up, I want to leave you with a couple of ideas, okay? So what's the point besides, of course, pagan practices? What's the result? Here's a couple of things I wrote down last night. The emphasis and prominence is placed on a select few. Clergy, worship team, choir, whatever. So emphasis and prominence is placed on a select few. There's a separation that has been introduced into the body of believers, elevating some over others. Congregants have adopted a mindset of entertainment and an attitude of passivity. And finally, this has rendered the overall body in a condition or a state of stagnation and ineffectiveness.
What was the last one?
It has rendered the overall body in a condition or a state of stagnation and ineffectiveness. Something has to change. We'll talk about this next week. How did God design the church? We'll look at the scripture references next week. But over these past 2,000 years, we've seen the church get increasingly stale and stagnant, increasingly ineffective, and increasingly has absorbed the mindset of it's all about me. How can I be entertained? What can I get out of this? And it wasn't the original design.